When we look at the human brain through the lens of modern neuroscience, one of the most striking features we discover is its ability to change itself structurally and functionally through experience. This phenomenon is called neuroplasticity. But while the term may sound abstract or purely academic, its implications are very real and incredibly relevant to anyone interested in growth, learning, performance, or self-mastery. At its core, neuroplasticity is the nervous system's mechanism for adaptation. It allows the brain to rewire its circuitry in response to environmental inputs, behavior, and internal states. While this plasticity is always occurring in some form, even as you listen to or read this content, it becomes particularly pronounced under one condition, when we are engaged in effortful, difficult, or uncertain tasks that require focused attention and physical or mental strain. This principle is not just theoretical. It's observable across multiple domains of cognitive science, behavioral neuroscience, and neurophysiology. Whether we are trying to learn a new language, recover from trauma, acquire a motor skill, or build emotional resilience, the degree to which the nervous system adapts is directly related to how difficult, uncertain, or unfamiliar the task is. And here's the key: neuroplasticity is not automatically on. It's not like a faucet that flows constantly. The brain doesn't change deeply just because time is passing. It changes because you signal to it that change is necessary. That signal often comes in the form of internal effort. To understand how this works, let's get specific about what happens in the brain when we encounter a challenge. Imagine you're attempting something outside your comfort zone. Maybe it's public speaking, lifting a heavy weight, solving a complex problem, or controlling an impulse. As you begin, your nervous system detects the challenge. This activates areas like the anterior cingulate cortex, the prefrontal cortex, and the locus coeruleus, all of which are involved in error detection, effort, and arousal. Neurochemicals like norepinephrine and acetylcholine begin to surge. These chemicals sharpen your focus, heighten your alertness, and amplify the strength of neural firing in circuits related to the task at hand. That's not just an energy boost, it's a biological signal that tells your brain this matters. And when that signal is repeated, especially with deep focus and repetition, the circuits involved begin to rewire. Synapses that are used more frequently become stronger through a process known as long-term potentiation, or LTP. Connections that are underutilized are pruned away. This is how habits form, how memory consolidates, and how our sense of identity, capacity, and confidence begin to change. However, it's critical to emphasize that this process is gated by a threshold of difficulty. If a task is too easy, the brain has no reason to update its circuitry. It already knows how to do it. There's no tension, no urgency, no need for metabolic investment. But when a task is hard, when it pushes your current limits, your nervous system is essentially faced with a choice: adapt or fail. And it is in that moment, in the face of failure or friction, that the deepest learning takes place. Consider the example of motor learning. If you're trying to improve your tennis serve, the greatest changes in brain circuitry do not occur when you're serving perfectly. They occur when you're struggling, when your timing is off, when your balance is shaky, when you have to slow down and consciously adjust your swing mechanics. In those moments, you're creating errors. And it is through the detection and correction of those errors that the brain begins to reshape its motor maps. The cerebellum, which is heavily involved in motor error correction, lights up. Neural firing patterns in the motor cortex begin to reorganize. Synaptic changes are made to reflect the new, more accurate movement pattern. Without those mistakes, without that struggle, there would be no reason for the brain to change. This applies just as much to emotional and cognitive growth. If you're trying to build emotional resilience or break out of a behavioral pattern, such as avoidance, procrastination, or self-sabotage, the same principles hold true. You have to voluntarily confront discomfort. You have to override the default pattern. That act of overriding, choosing a harder response instead of the habitual one, activates prefrontal cortical circuits responsible for executive control. The more you activate those circuits in difficult situations, the stronger they get. They form a kind of internal muscle for self-regulation. And just like a physical muscle, they only grow when they're challenged. Another key point to understand is that this type of plasticity is experience, dependent but context sensitive. The environment, your physiological state, and your mind set all influence whether the brain interprets a challenge as a growth opportunity or as a threat to avoid. This is why mindset matters not in a motivational sense, but in a neurobiological one. If you perceive difficulty as dangerous or as evidence of inadequacy, your brain and body may shift into a defensive stress response, dominated by cortisol and sympathetic arousal. This kind of stress, if prolonged, can inhibit learning and plasticity. But if you interpret the same challenge as an opportunity for improvement, if you remain curious, attentive, and task-focused, your body releases dopamine and adrenaline in a more adaptive way. These chemicals help you stay engaged, enhance neuroplasticity, and even provide a sense of reward during the challenge itself. This is one of the reasons why elite performers across disciplines, athletes, musicians, special forces, surgeons, often speak of learning to love the process, not just the results. Because the process is where the brain actually changes. This has enormous implications for how we approach personal development. It means that discomfort is not the enemy of growth. It is the requirement for it. Growth is not the absence of struggle. It is the product of it. The very circuits in your brain that handle focus, discipline, self-assessment, and decision-making are designed to get stronger through use. But that use has to occur under challenge. Without resistance, those circuits weaken. This is not metaphorical. It is measurable. You can even observe this principle in recovery and neurorehabilitation. Stroke patients, for instance, regain lost motor function not by passively waiting for the brain to heal, but by engaging in intensive, effortful, and often frustrating movement therapy. That frustration, when paired with effort and repetition, drives neuroplastic change. It forces the brain to find new pathways to adapt, to reconfigure itself. And over time, those adaptations restore function. So the takeaway is clear. If you want to change, if you want to learn faster, build discipline, grow emotionally, or become more resilient, you need to engage in tasks that are just beyond your current ability, not impossibly difficult, but difficult enough that they demand full attention, full effort, and sustained engagement. This means that periods of friction, fatigue, and even failure are not signs that you're doing it wrong. They're evidence that you're doing it right. They are signals that your nervous system is on the edge of adaptation. That's where the real growth occurs. It's also worth noting that recovery is an essential part of this process. Plasticity is initiated during the struggle, but it is consolidated during rest, particularly during sleep. During deep sleep and REM sleep, the brain replays the neural patterns from waking experience. Synapses that were tagged for change are either strengthened or eliminated. So if you're pushing yourself through hard things, you also need to give yourself the recovery time and the sleep necessary for those changes to lock in. Without rest, effort doesn't lead to lasting change. It leads to burnout. What does this mean for your day-to-day life? It means you should actively seek out discomfort in the domains you want to grow. Not randomly, not recklessly, but deliberately. You should pay close attention to what makes you hesitate, what you avoid, what feels difficult, and lean into it repeatedly. Whether it's starting a conversation that intimidates you, learning a complex concept, or pushing through physical fatigue, these experiences send a powerful message to your brain. This is important. Adapt accordingly. With time, what once felt overwhelming becomes manageable. What was once confusing becomes intuitive. Not because the world changed, but because you changed. Your brain rewired itself around your effort. That's the essence of neuroplasticity, and it's available to you every single day, if you're willing to do the hard things. Dopamine is a molecule that plays a critical role in human behavior. It influences motivation, learning, reinforcement, and how we direct our attention. Often misunderstood as simply a pleasure chemical, dopamine is far more accurately described as a molecule of pursuit. It's not just about how we feel when we succeed. It's about how and why we keep going, especially when things are hard. What makes dopamine fascinating is not just its role in reward, but its fundamental involvement in how we engage with effort itself. In fact, one of the most powerful discoveries in neuroscience is that dopamine is not simply released upon achieving a goal. It is released during the pursuit of that goal, especially when effort is involved. This has profound implications for how we grow through difficult experiences. It tells us that struggle, friction, and exertion are not just obstacles to be overcome on the way to success. They are the very mechanisms that engage the dopamine system and drive neuroplastic changes when we are working toward a challenging goal and we choose to lean into the process, not just tolerate it, but value it. Dopamine is released along the way. And that dopamine fuels future motivation. It acts as a kind of emotional and biochemical reinforcement signal that says, this direction is worth continuing. There's something valuable here. One of the key features of dopamine is that it's part of what's known as the mesolimbic reward pathway. This is a system in the brain that includes areas like the ventral tegmental area VTA, the nucleus accumbens, and the prefrontal cortex. These regions work together to create feelings of drive, anticipation, and reward. When dopamine is released along this pathway, it doesn't just make you feel good. It reinforces the behaviors that preceded its release. This is crucial. The brain isn't just interested in pleasure, it's interested in learning how that pleasure was obtained so it can repeat those behaviors in the future. If you exert effort to achieve something, and dopamine is released during that effort, your brain encodes that exertion as meaningful. It becomes part of your identity, your habits, and your sense of what you're capable of. But here's where things get really interesting. The largest, most sustainable dopamine increases don't come from shortcuts or passive rewards. They come from earned rewards, especially when effort and challenge are involved. When you do something hard and you focus on the process itself, on the strain, the focus, the internal struggle, your brain releases dopamine as a result of the effort, not just the outcome. This is called effort-based dopamine release, and it's a mechanism that exists to promote adaptive behavior. It helps organisms learn that doing hard things voluntarily often leads to important rewards, both internal and external. In contrast, when we chase rewards that are purely external, money, praise, status, or easy hits of pleasure from substances or compulsive behaviors, we can get dopamine release, but it's usually short-lived, unsustainable, and increasingly diminished over time. The brain begins to expect dopamine without effort, and the result is a lowered baseline. This is often referred to as the dopamine dip. When we get used to easy rewards, our motivation for long-term goals and difficult tasks begins to collapse. It's why many people experience burnout, distraction, or apathy, even when things seem to be going well externally. The internal reward system has been hijacked by passive reward, seeking instead of process-driven engagement. But when we reverse this, when we intentionally focus on the effort we're making, and we mentally reward ourselves for showing up, staying focused, or persisting through difficulty, we actually elevate our baseline levels of dopamine over time. That means we don't just get a spike when something good happens. We start to feel more motivated, more energized, and more capable day to day. The effort becomes reinforcing in itself. This is not just psychological, it's biochemical. Dopamine is literally released in response to the signal, I am doing something difficult, and I am choosing to continue. That choice triggers dopamine release, and the dopamine makes it more likely you'll repeat the effort again. This is one of the core mechanisms by which hard work and discomfort become growth-inducing forces. When we pair effort with internal reward, when we say to ourselves, this is hard, but it's good that I'm doing it, we strengthen the neural circuits involved in resilience, persistence, and attention. Over time, we build what researchers call intrinsic motivation, which is the ability to engage in behavior for its own sake, not because of some promised outcome. Intrinsic motivation is strongly linked to long-term success, emotional well-being, and the ability to thrive in complex or uncertain environments. Let's look at a simple example. Imagine two people are training for a marathon. One person is highly focused on the medal, the applause, the social media post at the finish line. The other person chooses to focus on the process, on the early mornings, the cold weather runs, the burning lungs, the moments when their legs feel like lead, but they keep going anyway. Both might finish the race, but the second person is engaging their dopamine system during the process, which means their brain is learning to associate effort with reward. That feedback loop will remain with them long after the race ends. It will shape how they face future challenges. The first person may feel a rush of dopamine when they cross the finish line, but it will likely fade quickly, and the motivation to continue training might disappear with it. Why? Because they were chasing external reward, not internal reinforcement. This same principle applies in education, business, relationships, and even recovery from addiction or trauma. People who learn to anchor their sense of meaning in the process, who focus on showing up, putting in the work, doing the hard thing even when they don't feel like it, are building a deeply powerful relationship with their dopamine system. They are training their brain to value effort, to stay resilient in uncertainty, and to derive satisfaction from growth, not just outcomes. That doesn't mean outcomes don't matter, they do. But when we only allow ourselves to feel good after we succeed, we limit the amount of motivation and learning that can occur. When we learn to feel good during the effort, we activate a kind of superpower. We become more consistent, more focused, and more resistant to burnout. There's also a very practical implication of this. You can literally increase your baseline dopamine by how you talk to yourself during effort. Studies have shown that self-directed statements like "this is hard, but I'm doing it," or "this struggle is part of the process," increase dopamine signaling and shift brain activation toward task-focused regions. It's not just about being positive. It's about reinforcing the idea that effort is meaningful. That belief itself triggers the neurochemical cascade that leads to growth. This is one of the reasons practices like deliberate cold exposure, high-intensity training, fasting, or even meditation are so powerful. They involve voluntary discomfort. When we choose to put ourselves into a challenging situation and remain focused and calm, we train our brain to pair difficulty with reward. Over time, we stop avoiding discomfort and even start to seek it out. Not because we enjoy suffering, but because we recognize that the internal reward of doing something hard is far greater than the fleeting pleasure of passive consumption. Another important insight from the science of dopamine is the idea of intermittent reward. When rewards are unpredictable or come only after sustained effort, dopamine spikes more dramatically. This is why learning to tolerate the unknown, whether that's a long learning process, an uncertain project, or a difficult personal journey, is such a critical skill. If we learn to keep going without needing a guaranteed result, and we reward ourselves internally for persisting, we are literally leveraging the brain's most powerful motivational system. We are setting ourselves up not just for external success, but for internal resilience. There's a final layer to this. When we chase dopamine externally through easy hits, scrolling, overeating, drugs, shortcuts, the brain becomes less sensitive to it. It adapts, the receptors downregulate. This means it takes more stimulation to feel the same level of reward, and over time, even basic effort starts to feel unbearable. But when we earn dopamine through challenge and process, the brain maintains a healthier balance. It stays responsive. It remains tuned to natural, meaningful rewards. So if you want to grow, if you want to build lasting motivation and resilience, the key is to embrace effort as a source of reward. Train yourself to find satisfaction in showing up, in doing the hard thing, in staying engaged even when the outcome is uncertain. That's where the dopamine lives, and when you pair that with consistency, recovery, and time, you build a brain and a life that is built for growth. The human brain is an extraordinary organ. It has the remarkable ability to change itself in response to experience, to adapt, to rewire, and to improve its function. This capacity is called neuroplasticity. It refers to the brain's ability to form new neural connections and reorganize existing ones in response to learning, challenge, or injury. It is the foundation of how we grow mentally, emotionally, and behaviorally. But there is a misconception about neuroplasticity that needs to be corrected. It doesn't occur just because we want it to. It doesn't happen by sitting still and passively absorbing information. Neuroplasticity is not activated in comfort. It is activated by challenge, by friction, and by focused effort under strain. It's during these exact moments when we are outside our zone of certainty and comfort that the brain recognizes a need for adaptation and begins to rewire itself. The brain does not change when things are easy. Easy tasks do not require new patterns of activity. They rely on old circuits that are already efficient, already formed, already running on autopilot. It is when we encounter something hard, something that stretches us mentally, emotionally, or physically, that the nervous system gets the signal, this situation demands more from me. I need to change. That signal comes in the form of focused attention, elevated levels of acetylcholine and norepinephrine, and increased metabolic demand. These neuromodulators flood specific areas of the brain, marking certain synapses for change. And it is during this state of struggle, of intensity, of discomfort that the brain becomes malleable, more capable of encoding new patterns. This is why learning a new language, acquiring a physical skill, or adapting to new emotional patterns is so difficult but also so transformative. Each time you engage with something that's just beyond your current ability, the brain has to decide, should I stick with what I know, or should I adapt? And when you persist in that challenge, when you direct your attention, even as it becomes harder, you're telling the brain, pay attention, this matters, adapt to this. That adaptation is the root of neuroplastic change. In the lab, we see this through various experiments. When animals are exposed to a novel environment or task that requires new behavior, something they haven't done before, their brains light up in very specific ways. You can literally see increased neural firing in the hippocampus, which is involved in memory formation, and the prefrontal cortex, which governs decision-making and attention. But what's fascinating is that this doesn't happen if the task is too easy. If the animal is placed in a repetitive, known situation, there's no reason for the brain to adapt. Plasticity is essentially turned off. It's as if the brain says, nothing new to learn here. This same pattern occurs in humans. If you are doing something that you've already mastered, the brain shifts into efficiency mode. But when you're in a state of effort, especially when you're struggling to perform or comprehend, you're triggering the systems that say, let's grow, let's change, let's create new circuits. What many people don't realize is that this process is metabolically expensive. The brain consumes more energy during learning than at any other time. It's physically demanding. That's why doing hard things, truly hard things that require attention and push you toward fail, feels uncomfortable. That discomfort is not a signal that something is wrong. It's a biological indicator that your brain is in the act of reorganizing itself. Think of it like resistance training for your nervous system. The same way lifting a heavy weight creates damage in muscle fibers, which then rebuild stronger, struggle in learning or growth causes temporary destabilization in neural circuits, which then rebuild stronger, more efficient, more adapted to future challenges. It's also important to understand that neuroplasticity follows a two-step process. First, there's the trigger. This is the challenge, the focused effort, the state of difficulty. But second, and equally important, is recovery. During deep rest, sleep, or moments of reflection, the brain consolidates the changes initiated during effort. It solidifies the neural pathways that were activated and prunes away the ones that were not. So if you're engaging in high levels of challenge but not getting sufficient sleep or recovery, you're not completing the plasticity loop. You're initiating change but not locking it in. This is why effort alone isn't enough. It needs to be paired with strategic recovery. When people say they want to grow, what they often mean is that they want the results of neuroplasticity without the discomfort of engaging it. But it doesn't work that way. If you want to become more focused, you have to train focus by resisting distraction, which means experiencing frustration. If you want to become more emotionally resilient, you have to confront emotional discomfort, not avoid it. If you want to improve physical skill, you have to push through awkwardness, imbalance, and repeated failure. In every domain, growth comes at the cost of momentary discomfort. But that discomfort is the very thing that makes the brain pay attention and change. This applies especially to youth and development, but it continues throughout adulthood. While plasticity is more easily triggered in children and adolescents due to higher baseline levels of certain neuromodulators, adults retain the ability to change their brains throughout life, but it requires more intentionality. In adults, plasticity is gated by attention and effort. In other words, you can't drift into a new pattern, you have to work for it. This is actually empowering because it means that anyone, regardless of age, can learn new skills, break old habits, and create new emotional and behavioral patterns. The entry price is focus and challenge. There's another layer to this. How we interpret challenge changes how effectively plasticity occurs. If you view a challenge as threatening, if your mental framing is rooted in fear or avoidance, then the brain shifts into defensive mode. Cortisol levels rise and learning shuts down. But if you view the same challenge as an opportunity, if you reframe the struggle as meaningful, even if it's hard, then you activate a very different cocktail of neuromodulators. You release adrenaline to energize, dopamine to reinforce progress, and acetylcholine to mark important synapses for learning. The challenge becomes a trigger for growth, not a threat to avoid. So mindset isn't just psychological, it's biochemical. How you think about your struggle determines how your brain encodes it. That's why it's so important to lean into difficult moments with intentionality. When something feels hard, whether it's a conversation, a workout, a mental task, or an emotional pattern, you have a choice. You can retreat and preserve your current wiring, or you can engage and build new circuitry. Every moment of struggle is an opportunity for directed neuroplasticity, but it only happens if you choose to stay in the zone of effort. Not so far into failure that you shut down, but far enough beyond comfort that your brain wakes up and begins to adapt. And this isn't just about productivity or self-improvement. It's about identity. When we do hard things repeatedly, and we do them with intention and focus, we start to reshape how we see ourselves. We become someone who seeks challenge, who knows how to learn, who is not afraid of discomfort. That internal shift is one of the most powerful outcomes of neuroplasticity. It's not just your brain that changes. Your relationship with yourself does. And that is a form of growth that radiates into every domain of life. In neuroscience, there's a phrase, neurons that fire together wire together. It's a reminder that whatever we repeat, we reinforce. If you repeat comfort, distraction, avoidance, you strengthen those patterns. If you repeat effort, attention, and persistence, you wire in growth, discipline, and resilience. Neuroplasticity doesn't discriminate, it encodes what you practice, so the question is not whether your brain will change, but what you are training it to become. This also means that every hard thing you do voluntarily becomes a kind of investment. Each time you push into discomfort, you are not just achieving something external. You are restructuring your internal capacity. You're building a more adaptive brain, a brain that knows how to face stress without shutting down, a brain that knows how to focus when it matters, a brain that doesn't retreat from challenge, but recognizes it as the signal for transformation. So if your goal is to grow not just temporarily, but deeply and structurally, the path forward is clear. Find something hard, something that makes you concentrate, stretch, and maybe even stumble. Choose to engage it, to stay with it, and to reward yourself not for succeeding, but for sticking with the process. That is the formula. That is how neuroplasticity is triggered, and that is how you build a brain in a life that is constantly learning, adapting, and evolving forward. The actions we take consistently over time don't just shape our skills or outcomes. They fundamentally shape our identity. What we do is what we become, and perhaps the most transformative path to becoming more resilient, more focused, more capable is through doing hard things on purpose. Not occasionally, not just when required, but as a deliberate practice. Every time we engage with difficulty voluntarily, every time we step into a challenge rather than step away from it, we are sending a powerful signal to the nervous system. This is the kind of person I am becoming. At the neurological level, identity is not a fixed structure. It is a pattern, a composite of thoughts, behaviors, emotional responses, and memories that the brain assembles into a working model of the self. And this model is plastic. It can be changed, but it doesn't change just by wishing or thinking differently. It changes by doing. When you engage in behavior that contradicts your previous limits, when you push beyond what you thought you could do, the brain begins to reorganize its assumptions about who you are. It begins to form new networks around capability, discipline, and self-trust. And over time, these new networks become the dominant model of identity. But the key element here is repetition. A single hard effort, a cold plunge, a long run, a tough conversation can be impressive, but it is not enough to alter your sense of self. It's what happens when those actions are repeated that begins to change the narrative. The first time you do something hard, it's a disruption. It's a signal to the system that says, this is different. But it's only through returning to the challenge consistently and intentionally that the nervous system begins to integrate that signal and say, this is now part of who we are. The underlying mechanism of this shift involves several layers of neural processing. At the surface level, there's the behavioral pattern, the actual act of doing the hard thing. Beneath that is the autonomic response, the activation of stress, effort, arousal. Beneath that is the meaning we assign to the experience. When we experience challenge and interpret it as valuable, even desirable, the emotional salience of the moment increases. The brain tags it as significant. Neuromodulators like norepinephrine and dopamine are released, which highlight and encode the behavior. These molecules act like chemical highlighters, emphasizing the neural patterns associated with effort and persistence. The more often this process occurs, the more embedded those patterns become. Eventually, the brain begins to predict and expect the behavior. It anticipates that we will rise to the challenge. This prediction loop reinforces the identity of someone who does hard things, not as a one-time feat, but as a default. And this is where the real transformation happens. We stop needing to convince ourselves. The internal resistance begins to shrink. The narrative shifts from "I hope I can do this" to "this is just what I do." That shift is powerful. It becomes a source of strength in moments of uncertainty or adversity. Because when identity is aligned with resilience, the question is no longer, can I? But how will I? What's important to understand is that this process doesn't depend on massive external goals. You don't have to run a marathon or build a company to reshape your identity. What matters is that you choose to face what is difficult for you, and that you do so repeatedly, with attention and intention. For some, that might be getting out of bed early. For others, it might be having a vulnerable conversation, pushing through social fear, or staying consistent with small daily habits. The content of the difficulty isn't as important as the relationship you build with it. And when you repeatedly choose the hard path, you strengthen the circuitry that supports courage, adaptability, and self-trust. From a neurological standpoint, this consistency is essential. The brain loves patterns. It builds internal models based on predictability and reinforcement. When you behave in a certain way again and again, the brain allocates more resources to those pathways. It prunes away alternatives and strengthens the dominant behavior. So if you consistently avoid difficulty, your brain becomes excellent at rationalizing avoidance. If you consistently seek out difficulty, your brain becomes excellent at generating effort and focusing under pressure. In both cases, your identity follows the neural wiring. There's also a profound emotional component to this. When you start doing hard things voluntarily, you begin to build evidence that you can trust yourself. You create a track record not just for the outside world, but for your inner world. Every time you show up and follow through, even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable, you deposit another unit of trust in your internal bank. Over time, this accumulates into deep self-confidence, not the loud, performative kind, but the quiet, grounded confidence that comes from knowing, I can count on myself. And this self-trust is one of the most valuable psychological resources you can develop because it influences everything. When you trust yourself to do hard things, you become more willing to take risks. You stop waiting for ideal conditions. You start to recognize discomfort not as a barrier, but as a gateway to transformation. This makes you more creative, more resilient, more adaptable. You move through life with a different posture, less reactive, more intentional. Now, this process also requires an honest relationship with failure. Because if you are truly doing hard things, you will encounter setbacks. You will face moments when you fall short, when your efforts don't yield immediate results, when your discipline cracks. And that's part of the process. Growth doesn't come from perfection, it comes from pattern. What matters is not whether you stumble, but whether you return. Each time you recommit to the path after falling off it, you reinforce the narrative that effort matters more than outcome. That process matters more than pride. That learning is more valuable than comfort. This loop between effort and identity is also visible in the brain's reward system. When you engage in difficult tasks and experience intrinsic satisfaction, not because you succeeded externally, but because you endured internally, you activate dopaminergic reinforcement. That reward signal says, "This is who I am." Over time, this reshapes your internal value system. You begin to derive satisfaction not from what is easy or entertaining, but from what is effortful and growth-inducing. The reward shifts from consumption to creation, from passive pleasure to active engagement, and something else emerges as you continue this practice: humility. Not the kind that comes from insecurity, but the kind that comes from realizing how much there is still to learn. Because the more you stretch your limits, the more you realize how much more is possible. Doing hard things reveals your capacity, but it also reveals your edges. And in that space between what you can do and what you might one day be able to do, humility takes root. It keeps you curious, grounded, and open. This humility is powerful because it keeps you learning. One of the greatest risks to sustained growth is the illusion of arrival. The belief that you've figured it all out, that you no longer need to stretch. But when your identity is built around effort, not achievement, you never arrive. You are always evolving, always engaging, always becoming. And this brings us to a deeper philosophical point. Your identity is not a fixed trait, it's a trajectory. It's the sum of your repeated actions, your interpreted experiences, and your intentional choices. You are not stuck. You are in motion. Every hard thing you choose to do today is shaping the version of you that will exist tomorrow. Every moment of resistance overcome becomes a thread in the fabric of who you are. You are becoming the person who can handle more, who can give more, who can serve more, and that's not just neuroscience, that's character. So if you want to grow in a way that lasts, if you want transformation that's not just external but internal, the path is clear. Deliberately do what is difficult, make it part of your day, make it part of your rhythm, not to prove something to others, but to evolve your own nervous system. To change your own belief about who you are, the repetition of voluntary effort becomes the forge where identity is recast. It's not always glamorous, sometimes it's boring, sometimes it's silent, sometimes it happens when no one is watching. But that's where the most powerful changes occur, in the moments where you choose effort over ease, focus over distraction, presence over passivity. In those moments, you are literally reshaping your brain, your body, and your belief system. You are earning your future self. And when you string enough of those moments together, when you make that your lifestyle, something extraordinary happens. You stop needing motivation. You stop relying on external permission. You stop chasing validation because your identity has been rewritten. You are someone who does hard things, and that changes everything.